Netanyahu recently appeared before media outlets and issued a warning to America and Europe that ought to alarm every Western official. If Israel collapses, he cautioned, you collapse alongside us. This isn't standard diplomacy, this is coercion. And here's the story. Mainstream sources aren't covering about the Wednesday conference that compels his actions. The footage emerged 48 hours earlier, Netanyahu addressing Western administrations. Fox News recorded his precise statements. December 17th. I insist that Western administrations do what is essential to combat anti-Semitism and deliver the necessary safety and protection for Jewish populations globally. They would be prudent to acknowledge our warnings. I insist on action from them. Now pause. Examine that language. Acknowledge our warnings. Which warnings? What occurs if they don't acknowledge them? The warning becomes more apparent when you grasp Netanyahu's internal political emergency. Al Jazeera disclosed 5 days earlier that he confronts corruption prosecutions, judicial overhaul setbacks, and October 7th investigation pressures concurrently. His political continuation relies on sustaining emergency situations that make deposing him appear hazardous. But here's the pressure nobody addresses openly, the Samson option. Horn Review documented in August 2025 that numerous Israeli officials since 1974 have suggested nuclear counterattack if Israel encounters existential dangers and America pulls support. The principle derives its designation from the scriptural character who collapsed the temple, destroying himself and thousands of adversaries together. Netanyahu's latest declarations match this framework flawlessly. He's not requesting Western administrations for assistance. He's insisting on it. And the underlying warning, neglect to supply assistance. Observe what transpires when Israel encounters destruction. Now later, in Wednesday's Washington conference, Haaretz disclosed 12 hours earlier that Netanyahu travels to meet Trump amid resuming Iran discussions. The headline inquires, is this persuasion or coordination? Incorrect inquiry. It's ultimatum presentation. Netanyahu arrives Wednesday bearing particular demands. Trump authorized attacks on Iranian atomic installations. Foreign policy observed 5 days earlier that Netanyahu desires Iran's rocket capability restricted to 300 kilometers, barely insufficient of accessing Israeli land. He desires uranium processing eliminated completely. He desires subterranean installations obliterated. And here's the warning. If Trump declines, Israel strikes independently, initiates Iranian counterattack, pulls American personnel into territorial conflict regardless, then criticizes Trump for inadequate assistance when American losses increase. Al Jazeera referenced Netanyahu's previous advisor, Mitchell Barak. There's a concern that Donald Trump will not attack Iran, which will persist to threaten Israel and alternatively negotiate a settlement that's beneficial for him as a peacemaker and abandon the government in position. That concern fuels Netanyahu's urgency, because if Trump negotiates settlement with Iran, Netanyahu forfeits his emergency rationale. Internal investigations intensify, corruption prosecutions advance, political opponents surface, coalition disintegrates. So Netanyahu requires Trump to sanction armed action, and Wednesday's conference presents the ultimatum. Attack Iran or observe Israel execute it independently, then confront repercussions when the territorial conflict you attempted preventing consumes American personnel nonetheless. The Times of Israel disclosed 1 week earlier that Netanyahu informed the Knesset, whoever strikes us will encounter unbearable repercussions. But the actual message aims at Washington, not Tehran. Support Israeli attacks or confront unbearable repercussions when Israel operates independently and pulls America into confrontation. Anyway, this clarifies the acknowledge our warnings terminology. Netanyahu isn't warning about outside dangers. He's warning Western administrations. Supply the armed assistance I'm insisting on, or observe me generate the emergency that compels your participation on inferior conditions than if you'd collaborated initially. Wednesday's conference evaluates whether Trump acknowledges this presentation or challenges back. The corruption prosecutions generate schedule pressure nobody's addressing openly. Netanyahu confronts 3 concurrent criminal proceedings involving bribery, deception, and violation of confidence. Testimony persists, evidence accumulates, conviction likelihood rises constantly, but Israeli legislation includes a peculiarity. Wartime prime ministers benefit from political protection from dismissal, even while criminal processes persist. So Netanyahu's continuation approach demands permanent emergency situations, blocking standard political responsibility. Foreign Policy recorded Netanyahu informed The Economist January 9th that he desires to reduce American armed assistance to nothing over 10 years. Surface interpretation, this appears like sovereignty. Actually, it's preparation for circumstances where American assistance becomes politically unfeasible to sustain. Why would Netanyahu willingly surrender $3.8 billion yearly? Because he foresees American internal politics, rendering that assistance untenable eventually. Superior to present the shift as Israeli decision rather than American desertion. And here's the assessment fueling that expectation. Gaza losses surpassed 71,000 based on Al Jazeera. American citizen sentiment transformed substantially against Israel. Pew investigation discovered Israeli approval declined 11 percentage figures in 3 years to merely 56%. Netanyahu grasps this pattern persists declining. Ultimately, even Republican assistance for absolute funding diminishes. So he's arranging Israel to assert sovereignty before America pulls assistance, preserving the account that Israel elects to stand independently rather than being deserted. But that arrangement demands proving Israel can endure without American backing, which demands eliminating Iran's capacity to endanger Israeli continuation, which demands persuading Trump to sanction the attacks Netanyahu desires, but cannot accomplish independently effectively. The paradox becomes apparent. Netanyahu asserts Israel should become sovereign from American funding, while concurrently insisting Trump dedicate American armed capability to eliminating Iranian atomic installations that Israeli personnel cannot dependably destroy. This isn't approach. It's urgency disguised as assurance, and Wednesday's conference reveals the paradox. Netanyahu will concurrently contend Israel merits sovereignty from American supervision and insist on American armed operations supporting Israeli goals. Trump must either acknowledge this paradoxical presentation or dismiss both foundations completely. The internal Israeli political circumstance renders Netanyahu's stance even more unstable. Chatham House's Yossi Meckelberg informed Al Jazeera the conflict with Iran would function as a valuable diversion from Netanyahu's internal difficulties, such as an investigation into administration failures concerning October 7th, his effort to diminish judiciary supervision authority, and his continuing corruption prosecutions. So Netanyahu requires conflict, not because Iran creates immediate danger. They've created the identical danger for 40 years. But because conflict supplies political protection for failures, investigations, and criminal cases that would alternatively terminate his profession. Wednesday's conference, consequently, benefits Netanyahu's individual continuation rather than Israeli homeland protection. He's exploiting American armed capability to address internal political challenges while presenting it as protecting Western society against Iranian dangers. The Samson option supports everything as underlying warning. If Western assistance collapses and Israel encounters destruction, atomic counterattack against territorial opponents becomes conceivable. Some experts construe Netanyahu's ambiguous warnings about unimaginable repercussions as disguised atomic warnings. Whether Netanyahu would genuinely sanction such attacks stays unknowable, but the uncertainty itself supplies pressure. Western officials must evaluate the likelihood, however distant, that neglecting to assist Israel sufficiently might initiate catastrophic intensification nobody desires. This is the atmosphere Netanyahu generates heading into Wednesday's conference. Trump confronts unfeasible selection, sanction attacks supporting Netanyahu's political continuation or decline, and hazard Netanyahu operating independently with catastrophic territorial repercussions. Wednesday's conference discloses who genuinely dominates American Middle East strategy. Does Trump establish conditions based on American concerns, or does Netanyahu's underlying atomic warning and territorial emergency manipulation compel Trump's agreement with Israeli insistences? The resolution establishes paths far beyond Iran particularly. It confirms whether American presidents can follow diplomatic resolutions against Israeli resistance, or whether Israeli prime ministers hold effective rejection over American territorial strategy through warning of independent operation. Netanyahu's latest outreach to European far-right organizations discloses his wider approach. Foreign Policy disclosed 1 week earlier that his Likud organization obtained observer position in Patriots for Europe, a coalition incorporating Hungary's Orban, France's Le Pen, and Netherlands' Wilders. Why develop far-right European assistance? Because conventional center-left European organizations progressively resist unlimited Israeli armed operation. Netanyahu requires substitute power foundations supporting his stances. As conventional European sentiment transforms, this signifies long-range arranging for circumstances where American assistance becomes politically untenable and European Union pressure rises. Netanyahu constructs connections with European officials who might oppose Brussels' pressure for penalties or responsibility. The corruption prosecution's schedule overlaps with all this. Decisions could materialize within months. If determined guilty, Netanyahu confronts imprisonment unless wartime situations validate preserving him in position despite criminal condition. So he requires endless emergency, blocking standard legal responsibility. Wednesday's conference consequently benefits individual rather than homeland concerns. Netanyahu insists Trump generates situations permitting Netanyahu's political continuation, regardless of criminal determinations, internal resistance, or global pressure. Trump's reaction discloses everything. Does he accommodate Netanyahu's insistences, or does he follow American concerns, incorporating diplomatic resolutions that might stabilize the territory but destroy Netanyahu's emergency rationale? Early signals recommend Trump doubtful of Netanyahu's presentation. His administration overturned Israeli resistance concerning Turkey and Qatar positions in Gaza management. They pressed Netanyahu toward compromise with Syria despite Israeli preference for antagonistic connections. They're energetically following Iran discussions despite Netanyahu's resistance. This path recommends Trump reluctant to subordinate American strategy to Israeli political requirements. If maintained through Wednesday's conference and forward, it signifies fundamental transformation in Israel-America relationships after generations of Israeli authority over American Middle East strategy. Netanyahu arrives Wednesday bearing insistences but missing pressure beyond underlying warnings. Trump can sanction attacks or decline and follow diplomacy, recognizing Netanyahu cannot genuinely strike Iran effectively without American assistance. The inquiry becomes, does Netanyahu's warning of independent operation bear reliability? Can Israel attack Iranian atomic installations independently? Would territorial conflict emerging from Israeli independent operation genuinely compel American armed participation? Probably not. Iran would differentiate between Israeli attacks and American strategy. They'd counterattack against Israel particularly rather than American personnel unless America engaged dynamically in attacks. So Netanyahu's warning of pulling America into conflict through independent operation may demonstrate hollow, which signifies Wednesday's conference discloses whether Netanyahu still holds authority over American presidents, or whether transforming political situations have destroyed that authority despite generations of tradition. The result matters beyond immediate Iran strategy. It confirms whether small partners can exploit American armed capability for internal political objectives through underlying warnings and emergency production. It establishes whether American presidents can follow diplomatic resolutions against Allied resistance, and it discloses whether Netanyahu's warning to Western administrations, "Acknowledge our warnings," bears genuine repercussions, or whether it signifies desperate posturing from a prime minister whose political continuation relies on endless emergency situations that American tolerance with may ultimately be depleting. Wednesday resolves these inquiries. Observe what transpires when Netanyahu departs Washington. Does armed activity rise? Do discussions persist? Does Trump sanction the attacks Netanyahu insists on? Those signals disclose who prevailed the conference and who genuinely dominates American Middle East strategy moving forward. I'm Dav, and this has been 3 Daily News.